Well, when I first heard about this group going out to the Kimberley on a project, I thought it sounded like a really good group of artists. There have been a lot of trips that artists have taken into the outback and on painting camps and painting trips, and I've been with them even. I've been to the Flinders Ranges and other places when artists go out there for a week or so and they all scatter and paint. But the Kimberley project sounded a little bit different. It sounded to me like something that had a much greater symbiosis of art and science. It was going off on a different level altogether. When you take a group of artists out, there's a chemistry between them. They get to know each other, they live in each other's pockets, they meet at the end of the day, they discuss things or perhaps they hide things, and the dynamics of the group tend to impact upon the kind of work they do as well. This is a very interesting group of artists because we're used to artists who are all landscape painters going out into the landscape and coming back with the predictable thing. Now, of this group, you would say that perhaps Elizabeth Cummings is a landscape painter. You'd say that Lucy Cullerton paints landscapes and Idris Murphy. But you certainly wouldn't say that about, say, Peter Godwin, who is not known as a landscape painter, but more a painter of interiors and still life. And John Peart, who we'd think of as an abstract artist. So we had a mixture of innocence and experience, but strangely enough, the two artists who were the most innocent of this practice of going out and painting in the landscape were perhaps two of the most experienced artists in the whole group. The AWC has quite a different way of putting people out in the landscape, that they're not just out there painting, they're out there learning about it as well. And what was interesting for me was to talk to a lot of the artists when they came back and to hear their experiences and to hear how inspired they felt by this. They'd been in a place where they'd got a tremendous sense of the physical structure of the place, the wildlife, and they came back with an enhanced understanding, and I think that shows in the work. What we've seen on this particular trip is that the artists have really enjoyed that close contact with the scientific world, and indeed the scientists seem to have enjoyed the contact with the artists.
I love a painting trip, and I was really interested in the other bunch of painters that were going. I had no idea what I was going to see in the Kimberley. I hadn't been there, I wasn't really sure what I was up for.
Living and working with other artists, no, that's an alien arena for me. I've always been a loner in that regard, and it's nothing against my colleagues at all.
Have you been out on these painting excursions before with groups of artists?
I did make a trip to the Stony Desert in about 1967, but not with other artists.
You don't have any difficulty going out with a bunch of artists and painting. I mean, you obviously enjoy the experience.
I do enjoy going out with a bunch of artists. I like it very much. I mean, we all go off and do our own thing, and then there's that lovely time of spending time together.
Idris, you've been in the Kimberleys before. What was different about this trip?
Yes, I have been to the Kimberleys a couple of times. I'm starting to think it's my favourite place to go. It's just fantastic.
Why is that? Are you just of a solitary disposition as an artist, or do you don't consider yourself a landscape artist? I mean, one of the things I was saying was you were the unusual person because you're more of an abstract painter.
Well, I think abstract painting is my default position, I guess, but who wants to be stuck in a default position?
Did it sound enticing?
Oh, cross it, because the Kimberley is the... See, I've been up the top end, but no further west than sort of, say, Darwin or Kakadu.
From a scientific perspective, the Kimberley landscape is probably one of the most important in Australia. And that's because it's such a rugged and ancient landscape, and it's so distant from the European centres of influence, that it's remained in many ways unchanged. A lot of the feral pests and the weeds and development and so forth that's blighted the rest of Australia and driven biodiversity into extinction hasn't occurred in the Kimberley. So the Kimberley is like the last pristine relic in some ways.
And so Kimberley has always been a bit of a prize. The only daunting thing was that I hadn't painted landscape for at least 10 to 12 years. I was curious to see what John would do with it, because coming from where he is, coming from that Wedderburn landscape, very craggy, rocky, big tall gums, in rhythms happening everywhere, as you can see in his work. It's full of rhythm. And then going to the Kimberley, fairly flat with occasional rises. I was very curious because Idris had done the desert before, so had Elizabeth.
So had Lucy.
And Lucy. I felt, oh, I've got a bit of a mate here. I felt he might have a bit of a struggle with this, same as me.
What's special about the Kimberley landscape as opposed to other landscapes?
It's very interesting. I mean, to go to another part of, you know, outback, I suppose we call it, Australia, and see quite a lot of difference. I think most of the time at Fowler's Gap or Menindee, there's no water. So here was a place, I mean, it was after the wet, but it was teeming with water. You know, that I couldn't get over that, the sort of semi-tropical nearly kind of Alice's Mary's Creek running through where we camped.
So you'd been before, but was that area you went to distinctly different to your other experience of the Kimberleys?
I'd driven up the Gibb River Road with a friend, and we were painting and stopping at different places to paint on the way. In Arnhem Land, yes, I've just gone into certain sites, but in the Kimberley, we had a marvellous trip just looking over the whole of the Mornington. There are similarities, but a lot of differences too. I mean, we saw boab trees. Some of the gorges were similar. Seeing them from the helicopter from up above was very, very special.
I've never been in a helicopter before. I mean, if there's one thing that happened in that whole program, that was the thing that was quite extraordinary.
Well, in the Kimberley, the helicopter really is the scientist's workhorse. We couldn't get by without it. A lot of the country's so rugged that on foot you can make 5, 6 or maybe 7 kilometres a day, and that's not carrying much. So we have to carry lots of monitoring equipment and scientific survey equipment and so forth. It just couldn't be done without the chopper.
The very first morning we got there, we had to get up before light, and we were down at the helicopter site, and they trucked us up, flew us up for breakfast on this bluff, which was just amazing.
Is this all right the way we're going?
Yeah, anyway.
The highlight for me at one level was flying through those gorges in that helicopter, coming across huge Aboriginal paintings which have been there for thousands of years.
And so we went down this gorge, you sweep in, you know, and the walls of the gorge feel like they're going to take the blades off the whatever it is. And anyway, we came to a slow sort of a halt. And about 50 metres above the river, on this rock face, was a large painting of a spirit figure. And we just sat there and we took some photographs, but he explained that the ledge that they stood on to paint that piece, it had given way. So what you have there is this Sistine Chapel-like image way up, and you'd think, you know, people coming after us will say, how did that get there?
Well, that rock painting, and Peter talked about that too, it was something that had been painted,
Yes.
but then the ledge had fallen away.
Off, so there was no evidence of how the painter got up there too.
It was just one of those things that seemed to be miraculously there
yes.
on the ledge.
Yes, a levitating painter. But at times I was so excited taking photographs, I turned the camera off.
I mean, the helicopter trail was worked its way into the painting.
It has. It has.
That little work here is really, that's a helicopter picture.
Yeah,
The helicopter trail, yes, I called it Butcher's Desire Line. That helicopter experience was another way of viewing the planet at a very close range. Even though you were in the air, it was a very physical thing.
Do you have a particular time of day that you like to paint? Are you after a certain sort of light?
No, I paint at all times of the day, but I do love what happens in the very early morning and the late afternoon. I mean, the intensity of colour. It's just good to be out in the landscape and looking at it, looking at the changes that happen.
Do you find that everywhere you go that the work distinctly changes in relation to those places, or do you think you're painting the same picture in different places?
Well, yes, I wonder if I'm painting the same picture in the different places, because yes, and I sometimes wonder if I am finding a way to interpret that particular landscape.
Does it take a bit of time? I mean, do you feel like sometimes...
It all takes time, that's right, because in fact this bush I know very well and I've painted a lot, and it's very familiar, but it's still endlessly changing and endlessly surprising, and so any landscape that one goes into, one could spend a lot of time in. So these little trips, they're just fleeting glimpses, they're glimpses.
I love that feeling that anything can happen. I think that's when I feel the most alive when I'm working. There may be themes that come and go and I get excited about, but basically it's that feeling that anything can happen and each new work is a new start, a new beginning. My approach to painting is, I'd say, curiosity-driven or experimental. That has led me into many different modes of working, and some of them lend themselves to evoking landscape.
Do you take photographs, John?
Well, I took a lot in the Kimberleys, and over the years I've taken quite a few.
With that, I mean, do you use them as memory joggers? Do you get anything directly from a photo that you would work up into a picture?
Well, no, I don't work from photographs. Well, photographs, say, of the Kimberleys may remind me of being there, but I haven't been working from photographs for the painting. You know, I sometimes say I like to be ambushed, by the landscape.
Did you find that when you were out there, were you doing more observational things that fed into what you're doing now?
Yeah, I was. I was, setting up in a location and looking at what was there and virtually drawing or painting what I saw. And then I had plans for what I thought I was going to do when I got back to my studio. And a lot of it was based on the kind of grid structures in the escarpments and the molten oranges of the rising sun on the hillsides, and I think what I did there I don't think was worth preserving. I think I was too stuck in preconceptions to really respond to it, but I came away with very strong impressions, and somehow it's all filtered through since I got back.
And what about working with the other artists? Did you discuss things at the end of the day? Did you compare notes, or were you all more secretive?
Well, I remember Lucy saying something about, you're all serious artists, but I just paint what I see. And we all thought, we felt envious that she could approach it with such simplicity and guilelessness.
I found that I was a bit overwhelmed by the vastness and the bigness of the view. So what I ended up doing was honing in closer to smaller sort of objects, anthill, boab tree. The snappy gum forest was fantastic because in the heat of the day when it got really hot, it was shady and I could concentrate on trunks. It just was a lot easier for me to take in than the vastness of the huge big subject. So yeah, I loved the anthills. They were fantastic little sculptural things, and then I could sneak in a bit of bluff behind.
But so part of the fun of it for you is to go out with other painters. You like that idea of getting out there with a bunch of them in the landscape.
I love it. I get new ideas, steal colour palettes and see what they're doing, come back with a few new marks to make. And but yeah, no, I really like. Some people go off and hide and do their own private bit of painting, but I love to stand next to someone and just talk about. I'm always painting by myself, and it's a really special opportunity to actually go out painting with other people. It's pretty hard to plan, on a day-to-day basis painting with company. So to go on a painting trip with a bunch of people who are professional painters is a really good experience.
The way I actually see light, but in this terrain, but generally speaking now, I didn't used to, and how I incorporate that into the paintings is that I don't aim for a particular time of day. I particularly like the afternoon when you lose detail and gain sort of shape and a certain kind of atmosphere.
And to what extent, are your paintings observational? I mean, do you feel like you're actually recording what you see in the landscape, or are you translating it? Are you changing the colours, changing the forms?
Yeah. When I first came back from living in England, I really found it difficult to paint objectively in any kind of way. I mean, I paint 5 or 6 pictures roughly in the same time. They come about through looking at my whole surroundings.
And when you're out there, do you make lots of sketches? Do you draw? Do you work on paper? Do you work on board?
Most of the time when I'm in the bush on site, I paint smallish boards or boards that I can actually carry around with me, because if I'm walking a long distance, that becomes a problem. So there's that, and I do draw, and I do small works on paper, but all those are separate. I see them now anyway, I probably didn't once, but I see them now as individual, hopefully finished things. Okay. But the bigger stuff, I come back to the studio, that's a bit more haphazardous because I just start painting pictures. And, it could start off the Kimberleys, could end up Broken Hill or somewhere else, or it could start off Broken Hill and end at the Kimberleys, which is what's been happening a bit lately, because probably it was a pretty amazing experience.
Being a studio-based painter, in a sense, and not a plein air painter, I mean, I don't generally go out and walk through and experience physically what I paint. I observe.
Going to the Kimberleys was obviously stepping outside of your comfort zone. Are you an artist who's happy to do that, or do you do it with a certain amount of trepidation?
All the time.
All the time?
Yeah. There was one very interesting thing that occurred on the trip, which was very significant for me, regarding the relationship to the landscape. I had left a book I was taking to read at the airport at Broome, and I happened to mention this to Liz Cummings. And Liz being Liz, she, the following night, she said, "Here, Peter, here's a book to read. I've got another one." And it was a book called The Red Highway by Nicholas Rothwell. It was about the Kimberley and its surroundings. But he wrote about the area where we were, and he wrote in such a way that it pulled me right into that landscape on a different level, not a painterly level, an emotional one. You hear about this, how people just absolutely become besotted with that country.
And when you were taking your drawings and your sketches, were you thinking all the time of looking for a particular motif which might work as a larger work?
Yes.
Were you thinking of the major piece all the time?
I was thinking of one major piece, and this was it. It apart from the other places that we went to, I just, there was a great sense of space here, a feeling of space. I remember saying to Jason, who was taking a few shots at the time, I shouted to him, I looked across and I pointed to this great rock thing that was this, as I referred earlier, it was like some ark that had just been dumped there. And the painting really is about the nightjar, which is here.
Yeah.
There was a nightjar which was just circling and scooping up insects across the surface at dusk.
What about the scientist? Did that enhance the Kimberley's trip?
It definitely enhanced it for me. I love the precision involved in talking to them. And to think there were so many young ones up there too. Some people have said science is separate from the arts, but I'm actually a believer that it is not. They're both involved with investigation.
Well, look, from the very beginning in Australia, arts and science have worked hand in hand. So the early scientific explorers, particularly the botanists, they drew. They had artists with them to draw what were exquisitely beautiful pieces of art, which were also of huge scientific importance. Some artwork, in fact, is the only record we have of some species. There was a kind of rat that was drawn by a convict in the early days of the Sydney settlement. A beautiful illustration, clear enough that we can identify it without any question. It's a thing called the white-footed rabbit rat. It vanished from Sydney before any other record was made of it, and yet it was common enough that that convict, when he wrote on the bottom of the painting to describe it, called it the Naruk, the Aboriginal name for it, and said, it's a pest in the settlers' stores. So it was common enough to be a pest, but then gone.
Did you feel like you got anything special out of the trip through that experience?
It's a very good question. One of the things when you're working with scientists, and that's true of Fowler's Gap to some degree, and certainly true here, was that, and these guys here particularly, I think, you could recognise in their obsession, their dedicated kind of searching.
Well, I think both artists and scientists are obsessive personalities. You have to be to delve into something at that level of detail and either represent it or reflect it, or being a scientist trying to understand it, and then ultimately to try to preserve species. So yeah, they're pretty obsessive.
You know, that was one of the reasons of going on this trip. You want to support people who are seriously doing the kind of work they're doing out there. Scientists were, I think, really quite chuffed to be involved with the Conservancy because they were getting looked after and taken seriously.
I just thought we were going there to do landscape painting. But the science side was unbelievable. I borrowed a book and with the trees, because I kept saying, what tree is that? What plant is that? And each night I went to bed with my book looking up the trees of the Kimberley.
Particular trip certainly made me aware of the huge destruction that the feral animals are creating. I knew about it, but you know, it just became more and more clear how appalling it is.
It made me really scared for conservation. It just looked like the whole thing was sort of out of control. The feral cat population is just outrageous. And the other thing that I loved was they had this dog, Brangle, her name was, who was a cat dog, and her job was to sniff out the cats. So the cats, I had cats with radio collars that they'd caught previously and collared, but then their batteries had run out, so they have to find their cats. So they'd find their signal, find their cat, but then the dog actually had to find exactly where the cat was, and that was fantastic. And I thought that sort of work they were doing, studying where cats moved rather than just trying to eradicate cats, was so important. And they scared us because the scientists talk about the cane toad population coming in, and it all just sounds like it's too vast and too big and too out of control.
Look, despite the Kimberley's fairly pristine nature, there are threatening processes that are going on and threats coming closer year by year. Among them are fire management, because up until the 70s, a lot of that area was managed either by Aboriginal people with fire management or pastoralists. And now that is changing and we're getting more damaging fires. Cats are another problem, whether they're spreading more recently into the area or whether they're becoming more evident because of the fire changes, we don't know. But in certain parts of the Kimberley, cats are a major issue. And of course cane toads, you know, cane toads are knocking on Kimberley's front door, so that's another problem we have to manage.
Do these things seem more urgent to you than before?
Very much so. Yeah, very much so. Especially with their studies of the feral cats and the way they were tracking the cat as far as its damage to the ecosystem was concerned. Certain points they discovered, one being that the cat would, when he sensed, or she sensed there was a fire, even if it was 10, 15 kilometres away, they would leave their territory, go to that fire, break the edge, and because they'd wait for all the marsupials, all the animals who were escaping the fire, and they'd just gorge themselves and then go back to their territory.
It's amazing. It makes you feel like that the cats are all sort of like top cat, that they're the streetwise, smart animal, and then you've got all these poor mugs in the marsupials that get fleeing from the fire straight to the jaws.
Of course. And then there's the other aspect too, but then there's the police, which are the dingoes, which I love. That's something, that relationship I live in. So if the dingo population is kept up, it keeps the cat population down.
It just shows that there's promise, and their inventiveness of solving problems shows that there will be solutions, and that it's got to be fixed, and I think they're going to make it.
And you, I understand, you told me you had a bit of a visit from a feral animal in the night. You had a python.
Oh yes, I don't think he was feral. He belonged.
He was the real
He belonged, because I think the day before we'd seen a very young python as we were out walking, and but that night I heard a noise, and I got up, and thank God I turned the light on in the bathroom and looked, and the snake was huge, the python was huge, draped over the toilet, the sink, the shower, the whole thing. He turned on the shower. He was big.
And you just left him there? You didn't bother throwing him out? Oh,
no, I didn't tussle with him. I zipped myself very well into the tent.
And what about working with the other artists? Did you enjoy that? I mean, did you discuss things at the end of the day? Did you?
Oh, there's a bit of sharing at night when we're eating. Yes, a little bit of the excitement of certain landscapes.
It feels like a family. You go away with someone for a week, working and eating, and sharing all that time together. You can't help but get close.
Look, I think at the Australian Wildlife Conservancy, we're discovering that this project of preserving Australia's biodiversity really is one for the whole nation, not just part of it. And as we go about our work, we're finding some really interesting partnerships developing. And one of them, of course, involves this project, the Defiance Gallery, organised to send artists to the Kimberley, to AWC properties, in order to let them experience firsthand this amazing project. And through that, of course, have brought us many new friends and supporters.
Did you all get back together and look at each other's work?
Have a throwdown, John. Is that what you mean?
Did you have a throwdown, or did you keep it all to yourselves?
We were asked actually by the scientists there to have a little mini show at the end of the time, and we all just put up 3 or 4 works, and that was the first time that actually I'd seen what everyone else was doing.
I mean, those sort of experiences do heighten everything about an experience like that. You just don't forget it.
We've also been. Oh, you get that? Now that's what I want.
Was, again, as Brack said, painting is just a continuous series of acts of desperation.